Have you ever overheard something you shouldn't have, and that conversation changed your life forever? Richard Sterling, a New York City millionaire, never imagined a single sentence spoken by his housekeeper would change his life forever. He was used to the silence of his empty Manhattan penthouse, but that night, as he passed by the kitchen, he heard something that left him paralyzed. "I need a boyfriend for tomorrow." Isabella, his employee, was speaking on the phone, her voice choked with emotion, unaware that someone was listening. Stay until the end to discover how an unexpected favor turned into the most beautiful love story they never imagined. Richard walked through the corridors of his penthouse like a ghost in his own realm. At 45, he had built an empire many envied, yet every night he returned to a home where the echo of his footsteps was his only companion. The soaring walls, the imported furniture, the priceless art adorning every corner, all seemed to mock him with their opulent emptiness. He had achieved everything he wanted in life, except the one thing that truly mattered: someone to share it with. Business had given him money, power, and respect in New York, but it had stolen something he didn't even know he'd lost until it was too late. Now, silence was his routine, his self-imposed punishment, his inevitable reality. He ate alone, worked alone, slept alone. Social gatherings were mere obligations, where he faked smiles and conversations he forgot before arriving home. His employees maintained the professional distance he himself had established years ago, when he decided that emotional walls were safer than disappointments. Isabella was the only one who had been working with him for 3 years, discreet, efficient, almost invisible in her attempt not to disturb him. She was a 3-5-year-old woman of humble origins from rural Georgia, who had come to New York seeking a better life to support her family back home. On this Tuesday night, Richard was descending the stairs, thinking of reviewing some documents in his office, when something unexpected stopped him halfway. Isabella's voice drifted from the kitchen, muffled and trembling, different from the professional tone she always used with him. Richard stood motionless in the hallway, with no intention of eavesdropping, but unable to keep walking. He heard the unmistakable sound of someone holding back tears while talking on the phone. That mix of desperation and shame that only comes when life corners you with no way out. The words came in fragments, laden with an anguish that pierced the walls, like a silent cry for help. Richard had never heard Isabella like this. Vulnerable, human, real. For 3 years, she had simply been the woman who kept his home in order, who prepared his meals, who cleaned without a sound and disappeared when he arrived. But now, that choked voice revealed that Isabella was not just an efficient employee, but a person with problems, with fears, with a life he had never bothered to know. Curiosity compelled him to move a little closer, just enough to distinguish the words, but without being seen. He felt he was invading something private, something sacred, but his feet wouldn't obey the command to retreat. What he heard next hit him like a punch to the empty stomach of someone who had forgotten what it feels like to need something more than money. Isabella's voice rang clear, desperate, and impossible to ignore. "I know it sounds crazy, Lucy, but I need to. I need a boyfriend for tomorrow." Richard felt the air abandon his lungs as he processed what he had just heard. A boyfriend for tomorrow. The phrase sounded absurd, almost comical, like something out of a daytime soap opera. Yet there was nothing comical about Isabella's desperate tone, the way her words trembled as they left her lips. Richard leaned against the hallway wall, hidden in the shadows, trying to understand what situation could lead someone to ask for something like that. Isabella continued speaking, now with more urgency, explaining to her friend every detail of her dilemma, like someone confessing a sin they could no longer carry alone. Richard listened to every word with an attention he didn't even give to his most important business meetings. There was something in this raw vulnerability that kept him glued to that hallway, unable to leave, unable to pretend he hadn't heard anything. For the first time in years, Richard was witnessing something genuine, something that had no price or strategy, something that made him feel strangely alive. The silence of his penthouse had never seemed so deafening as it did in that moment, when another person's voice revealed a humanity he had forgotten existed. He wondered how many times Isabella must have had such problems, how many nights she must have cried in silence while he remained locked in his office, reviewing soulless numbers. Guilt began to rise in his throat, like a thorny vine. Isabella continued talking to her friend, and each word was like a window opened to a world Richard had completely ignored. She explained that her younger sister Sophia's wedding was the next day, a family event they had been planning for months, and which the entire family would attend. The problem wasn't the wedding itself, but the condition her family had imposed on her to be able to attend. It wasn't malice, Isabella insisted between sobs. It was just tradition. Her family was one of those who still clung to such traditions, where a 3-5-year-old woman without a partner was a cause for concern, for whispered comments, for looks of pity. Richard clenched his fists upon hearing this, feeling an unexpected anger towards people he didn't even know, but who caused so much suffering to someone who worked for him. Isabella went on to explain that her mother was ill, that the doctors didn't give her much time, that this wedding might be the last complete family gathering they would have, and the only thing her mother wanted, the only thing she had asked for with that weak voice of someone who can't ask for much more, was to see Isabella happy, accompanied by someone who would take care of her. The irony was cruel. Isabella had to fake happiness to give her sick mother peace. She had to lie about having love to demonstrate true love. Richard felt something strange stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in so long that he had almost forgotten its name. Empathy. The phone conversation continued, but now Isabella spoke more softly, as if shame weighed more than desperation. She told her friend Lucy that she had considered all options, that she had thought of cancelling, of inventing an excuse, of simply not showing up and letting her sister have her perfect day without complications. But she couldn't do that, she explained with a choked voice, because her mother had pleaded with her to go, because she wanted to see her there smiling, because perhaps this would be the last time they could all be together as a family. Isabella admitted that she had tried to ask 2 acquaintances for the favor, but both had refused, saying it was too strange, too uncomfortable, too complicated. Richard listened to every detail, feeling something inside him begin to move, to awaken after years of lethargy. He had spent so long functioning like a machine, making decisions based only on numbers and strategies, that he had forgotten what it was like to be moved by something more human, more visceral. Isabella ended the call, promising she would find a solution, though her voice sounded defeated, like someone promising the impossible just to end a painful conversation. Richard heard the sound of the phone being hung up, followed by a muffled sob Isabella tried to suppress. He remained in that dark hallway, processing everything he had just heard, feeling the weight of a decision he didn't yet know he was going to make. But something had changed in those minutes of involuntary listening, something that would make this night different from all the other empty nights of his life. Richard couldn't move from that hallway, as if his expensive designer loafers were glued to the imported marble floor. He heard Isabella's footsteps moving through the kitchen, the sound of water running, probably washing her face to erase the tears before finishing her tasks. He knew he should leave, return to his office, pretend he hadn't heard anything, and let Isabella solve her problems, as all responsible adults did. But something kept him there, an invisible force he couldn't name, but which he felt pressing against his chest. For 3 years, Isabella had been part of his life's decor, as present as the furniture, but equally impersonal. He had never asked her about her family, her dreams, her fears. He had never seen beyond the efficient employee who kept his world running smoothly, and now, in a matter of minutes, this invisible woman had become painfully real, with complex problems and emotions he had forgotten existed. Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time that day, feeling a strange urgency to do something, anything, to make that sound of muffled crying stop echoing in his head. It wasn't empty compassion, nor arrogant charity. It was something deeper, even more selfish, the recognition of a pain he himself knew too well. Isabella emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron, her eyes still red, but trying to regain the professional composure she always maintained. She didn't expect to find anyone in the hallway at that hour, much less Richard standing there like a statue, contemplating nothing. Their gazes met, and time seemed to stop in that hallway, lit only by the soft night lights. Isabella's eyes widened in horror as she realized he had been close enough to have heard her private conversation, her moment of shameful vulnerability. Color drained from her olive face, leaving her pale as if the earth were about to open beneath her feet. Richard saw the panic in her eyes, that fear of someone who has just exposed too much in front of the wrong person, of someone who knows they have crossed an invisible line separating the professional from the personal. Isabella took a step back, her hands trembling as she searched for words that could explain the inexplicable, that could undo what was already done. Richard raised a hand in a reassuring gesture, aware that any word from him at that moment could make Isabella flee or break down completely. He had to handle this carefully, with a delicacy he was not used to using in his daily interactions. The air between them was charged with discomfort, with unspoken words, with secrets exposed without permission. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have." Isabella began to apologize, her voice choked, her words stumbling over each other in her haste to explain herself. But Richard shook his head, stopping her before she could finish building a wall of unnecessary excuses. He realized in that moment that he had two options. He could do what he always did, maintain professional distance, pretend he hadn't heard anything, and let everyone solve their problems privately. Or he could do something different, something that scared him precisely because it came with no instruction manual or exit strategy. Isabella looked at him with pleading eyes, not asking for help, but begging him to simply forget what he had heard and allow her to retain her dignity and her job. Richard noticed the small wrinkles around her eyes, signs of sleepless nights and constant worries that he had never seen because he had never really looked. He saw her hands, chapped from so much work, her short, unpolished nails of someone who has no time for vanity, the bent posture of someone who carries invisible weights every day. Isabella was not just an employee. She was a complete woman, with a life full of responsibilities and pains that he had completely ignored. And now that reality was in front of him, impossible to ignore, demanding some kind of response. "You don't need to apologize, Isabella. I'm the one who overheard unintentionally," Richard said in a softer voice than usual, so different from the authoritative tone he used in his offices. Isabella blinked in confusion, not knowing how to interpret this unexpected kindness from a man who had always been proper, but distant. Richard realized he needed to give her space to explain herself, so she could decide how much to share without feeling obligated or judged. He leaned against the wall, adopting a less intimidating posture, less of a boss and more of an equal. Although both knew that the power dynamic between them would never be completely symmetrical, Isabella took a deep breath, wiping away a rebellious tear that insisted on rolling down her cheek despite all her efforts to maintain composure. She looked at the floor, unable to meet his gaze as she spoke, as if confessing her situation was admitting an unforgivable weakness. And then, in a trembling but determined voice, she began to explain what Richard had already heard, but what he needed to hear directly from her. She told him about her sister Sophia's wedding, the youngest of 4 sisters, the only one who had been lucky in love, according to her family's traditional standards. She explained that her parents were country folks from rural Georgia, from families where old customs still dictated the unwritten rules of coexistence, and where a 3-5-year-old woman without a husband was seen as a silent failure that everyone noticed, but no one mentioned directly. Isabella continued her explanation, now with more fluency, as if the words had been trapped in her throat for so long that they spilled out uncontrollably once they found their escape. She recounted that her 3 sisters were married with children, with lives her mother considered complete and blessed. But she, Isabella, had made different decisions. She had come to New York to find work when her father fell ill, sending money home every month to help with medical expenses and the needs of her nieces and nephews. She had sacrificed her own personal life for the well-being of her family, working long hours, saving every dollar she could, giving up outings, boyfriends, the possibility of building her own family. And now, with her youngest sister about to marry, with her sick mother wanting to see the whole family together one last time, Isabella couldn't simply show up alone and face the looks of pity, the comments disguised as concern, the uncomfortable questions about why she remained single. It wasn't vanity, she clarified in a firm voice. It was emotional survival. It was protecting her mother from the added worry of thinking her eldest daughter was alone and unprotected in a big, dangerous city. Richard listened to every word, feeling the simplistic image he had of his employee's life crumble. Isabella wasn't just a woman who cleaned his house and cooked his meals. She was a daughter who sent money to her family every 2 weeks, a sister who wanted to see her younger sister happy without ruining the day with her loneliness, a woman who carried the weight of impossible expectations on her tired shoulders. And Richard, for the first time in years, wondered how many times he had walked beside another's pain without even noticing it. Locked in his own bubble of privilege and self-imposed solitude, Isabella finished speaking, and the silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to have physical form, occupying the space between her and Richard like a transparent but impassable wall. She expected some kind of reaction, perhaps a sermon about keeping personal problems out of work, or worse, that fake compassion that rich people usually offer, like someone throwing coins to a beggar. But Richard remained silent, with an expression on his face that Isabella couldn't decipher, something between surprise and deep reflection. His eyes, normally cold and calculating when handling business, now showed something different, an unexpected warmth that disconcerted her more than any reprimand. Isabella hugged herself, feeling the cold night air seep in through the windows and mix with the chill of her own exposed vulnerability. She had never shared so much of her personal life with anyone in that house, and now she regretted every word spoken, every detail revealed. She wished she could go back in time, return to that moment before the phone rang, before her desperation made her drop her guard in front of the man who paid her salary. But time doesn't turn back, and words once spoken cannot be swallowed. Now all that remained was to await the consequence of her imprudence, to prepare for whatever came, be it pity, indifference, or dismissal. Richard finally moved, straightening up against the wall and taking a step towards her. Not menacingly, but almost carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal, not wanting to scare it further. "Is your mother very ill?" Richard asked, with a softness Isabella had never heard from him. A voice stripped of all authority and filled only with genuine curiosity. The question caught her off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was too appropriate, too human, too real to come from a man who always kept conversations superficial about the weather or food. Isabella felt a lump in her throat, feeling the tears threaten to return to her eyes, despite all her efforts to keep them contained. She explained that her mother had heart problems, that the doctors in her town didn't give her more than 6 months, that each day could be the last, and therefore every family moment became precious and unrepeatable. Richard listened with such intense attention that Isabella could feel the weight of his gaze, not judging, but absorbing every detail, as if it truly mattered to him. And maybe, she thought with surprise, maybe it did matter to him. There was something in the way he tilted his head, in how his hands remained still in his pockets instead of checking his watch or phone, that suggested a complete presence Isabella hadn't experienced with anyone in a long time. It was as if, for the first time in 3 years, Richard was truly seeing her. Not as the employee who folded his clothes or prepared his coffee, but as a person with complex stories and deep pains. "And your family won't accept you going to the wedding alone?" Richard said, not as a question, but as an affirmation, processing aloud the situation Isabella had described. She shook her head, feeling ridiculous, admitting it, but also relieved to be able to speak honestly about something that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She explained that her father was a man of ingrained customs, one of those who believed that a woman without a man is like a tree without roots, vulnerable to any storm. It wasn't malice on his part, Isabella quickly clarified. It was simply the way he was raised, the only reality he knew. Her mother shared these beliefs, though with more gentleness, more maternal concern than moral judgment. Both had made it clear that Isabella was welcome at the wedding only if she brought a companion, not to punish her, but because they genuinely believed that appearing alone in front of the entire extended family would be humiliating for her and worrying for them. It was a trap with no way out. Going alone meant admitting her loneliness in front of everyone. Not going meant missing the last family event with her mother alive. Isabella had tried to explain that she was fine alone, that she didn't need a man to be happy, but her words fell on deaf ears that couldn't or wouldn't understand a reality different from the one they knew. Thus, she had made the desperate decision to find a fake boyfriend, someone who could pretend for a day, just long enough to give her mother peace and her sister joy. But now, standing in front of Richard, confessing all this, the idea seemed more absurd than ever, a ridiculous plan from someone who had lost all perspective. Richard remained silent for several seconds, which felt like hours, his face showing deep concentration, as if he were solving a complex mathematical problem in his head. Isabella used this silence to regain some composure, discreetly wiping her eyes and smoothing her apron with trembling hands. She was ready for Richard to tell her it was her problem and to resolve it without involving the house, or worse, to find another job if her personal dramas were going to interfere with her work. She mentally prepared for any of these answers, building emotional walls to protect herself from the rejection that would surely come. But Richard said none of that. Instead, he looked at her with an expression Isabella couldn't interpret, something between admiration and sadness, as if he were seeing something in her he had never noticed before. He ran a hand over his jaw, a nervous gesture Isabella recognized from having seen him do it during difficult phone meetings. Finally, Richard spoke, but he didn't say what she expected. "I understand why it's important to you," he murmured in a husky voice, almost to himself. "No one should have to choose between their dignity and their family." Isabella looked at him in surprise, not knowing how to respond to this unexpected empathy. She had expected many reactions, but not genuine understanding, not this validation of her feelings that made her throat close with contained emotion. "Should I let you rest, Mr. Sterling? It's late, and I have to leave early tomorrow," Isabella said, trying to end a conversation that was becoming too intimate, too dangerous for her already vulnerable heart. She took a step back, seeking an exit, needing to put distance between herself and this man who suddenly seemed to see through all her defenses. Richard nodded, but didn't move, as if there was something more he wanted to say, but couldn't find the right words. Isabella took advantage of this moment of hesitation to turn around, walking quickly towards the stairs that led to her small room at the back of the house. She felt Richard's eyes following her, but she didn't look back. She couldn't risk seeing what expression he wore on his face, because something inside her told her that if she looked at him again, she would break completely. She went up the stairs with hurried steps, resisting the urge to run, maintaining a last vestige of professional dignity. Only when she closed her bedroom door did she allow herself to breathe again, sinking onto the small bed as tears finally flowed unrestrained. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely relieved to have shared this burden with someone, even if that someone was her millionaire boss, who had probably already forgotten her and was checking his emails. Isabella had no way of knowing that at that very moment, Richard was still standing in the hallway, looking where she had disappeared with a thoughtful expression that wouldn't leave his face all night. And she certainly couldn't imagine that the words she had spoken that night were planting something in the heart of a man who believed he had forgotten how to feel. Richard went up to his bedroom with slow steps, each stair weighing more than the last, as if he carried an invisible burden he had picked up in that hallway. He entered his enormous bedroom with its king-sized bed, which always seemed too big for one person, and sank into the armchair by the window, without even taking off his shoes. New York City gleamed outside with its nightlights, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding in the homes of its inhabitants. Richard looked at those lights without truly seeing them, his mind trapped in the conversation he had just had, Isabella's words echoing again and again in his head. "I need a boyfriend for tomorrow." The phrase had sounded desperate and ridiculous at the same time, but now, knowing the full context, it gained a painful meaning that deeply unsettled him. Isabella wasn't being superficial or capricious. She was caught between two impossibilities, between disappointing her family or betraying her own dignity. And Richard, for some reason he didn't fully understand, couldn't stop thinking about it. He took off his solid gold watch, a gift he had given himself when he closed his first big deal, and left it on the table without looking at it. That night, the weight of the metal on his wrist felt like a chain, reminding him of everything he had and everything he lacked. The hours passed with cruel slowness, as Richard remained awake in the darkness of his room, his mind traveling paths he normally avoided. He remembered the last time he had attended an important event, the wedding of a business partner's son 6 months ago. He had arrived alone, as always, and had spent the entire night smiling politely while dodging uncomfortable questions about his personal life. Older ladies asked him when he would settle down. Married men joked about his enviable freedom, and he pretended not to care, that he had chosen this life, that he was perfectly satisfied with his solitude. But the truth that only dares to emerge on sleepless nights was very different. Richard was tired of arriving alone everywhere, of always being the successful but lonely man, of pretending that material success compensated for emotional emptiness. He had built an empire, but lived in it like a prisoner, surrounded by luxuries that gave him no warmth, by successes he couldn't share with anyone who truly mattered. And now, listening to Isabella's story, he realized he wasn't the only one trapped in this kind of loneliness. She was also alone, also pretending, also carrying the weight of expectations she couldn't meet without betraying herself. The difference was that Isabella, at least, had a family who cared about her, even if mistakenly, while he didn't even have that. Richard got up from the armchair around 3 a.m., unable to sit still with all these thoughts swirling in his head like trapped birds seeking an escape. He walked to his private office, that sanctuary of work where he normally found solace in numbers and strategies that made logical sense. But that night, not even financial reports could capture his attention. His mind kept returning to Isabella, to her choked voice, to the way she had tried to maintain dignity even while confessing her desperate situation. There was something in that combination of strength and vulnerability that moved him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Richard thought of all the times Isabella had worked in his home over the past 3 years. Always efficient, always discreet, always invisible. He had never asked her how her family was, if she needed anything, if she was happy with her job. He had simply assumed that as long as she did her job well, nothing else mattered. And now he realized how selfish and blind he had been, how closed off in his own bubble of privilege. Isabella had been sending money to her family every 2 weeks, sacrificing her own life for the well-being of others, working long hours to pay for her sick mother's medical treatments. Meanwhile, he mentally lamented his self-imposed loneliness, doing nothing to change it. Shame began to overtake him like a heavy cloak he couldn't remove. The image of Isabella pleading with someone on the phone to be her fake boyfriend for a day wouldn't leave his mind, haunting him through the corridors of his empty home as dawn began to paint the sky with soft colors. Richard found himself in the kitchen, preparing coffee he didn't need, his hands moving automatically, while his brain processed an idea that had begun to form at some point during that sleepless night. It was an absurd, imprudent idea, completely out of character for someone like him, who always calculated every move with mathematical precision. But the more he considered it, the more sense it made on a level that was not rational, but deeply human. Isabella needed a companion for a day, someone who could pretend to be her boyfriend long enough to satisfy her family and give her sick mother peace. And he, Richard, a 4-5-year-old man who had forgotten what it meant to do something selfless for another person, could be that someone. He had no plans for that day. He never had real plans beyond work. He could dress well, drive to wherever this wedding was, pretend to be Isabella's attentive boyfriend for a few hours, and return to his normal life, without complications. In theory, it sounded simple. A favor between acquaintances, nothing extraordinary. But Richard knew it wasn't that simple, that there was something deeper motivating him, something related to his own loneliness and his need to feel useful, to matter to someone, even if only for a pretend day. The sun was beginning to filter through the windows when Richard heard Isabella's footsteps descending the stairs, probably to prepare breakfast before going wherever she had to go that day. He looked at his reflection in the kitchen window, seeing a middle-aged man with deep circles under his eyes and disheveled hair, very different from the impeccable businessman everyone knew. He wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, or if he was finally doing something right after years of living on autopilot. Isabella appeared at the kitchen door and suddenly stopped upon seeing him there, surprised to find him awake so early. Her eyes were still swollen from crying, and Richard noticed the dark shadows beneath them, which revealed that she, too, hadn't slept much. They looked at each other in silence for a moment, charged with discomfort and unspoken things. Both remembering the previous night's conversation, both unsure how to proceed. Isabella was the first to speak, murmuring a formal good morning as she walked to the coffee maker, avoiding his gaze. Richard knew he had to say something now, before he lost his courage. Before the daylight dissolved that strange clarity he had found in the darkness of the sleepless night. He opened his mouth, then closed it, feeling the words trapped in his throat, like stones that refused to come out. Isabella continued with her back to him, preparing coffee with trembling hands, probably wishing he would just leave and pretend the night before never happened. But Richard couldn't leave, not yet, not without saying what he had decided at some point between midnight and dawn. He took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff without knowing what lay beneath, and finally found his voice. "Isabella," Richard said in a firm but gentle voice, causing her to stop mid-movement with the coffee cup halfway to her lips. She turned slowly, her eyes full of apprehension, clearly expecting him to tell her something about keeping her personal problems out of the house, or perhaps that they needed to discuss her professional conduct. Richard saw the fear in her eyes and felt a pang of guilt, realizing that she saw him as a distant authority figure, rather than as a human being capable of empathy. That had to change, even if only for this once, even if only for a day. He walked to the kitchen table and sat down, an unusual gesture for someone who normally ate breakfast in his office, checking emails. He motioned for Isabella to sit too, but she shook her head gently, too nervous to accept this unexpected intimacy. Richard understood and didn't insist, respecting the boundaries she needed to maintain to feel safe. He looked at his cooling coffee on the table, searching for the right words to express something he himself didn't fully understand. He had spent all night thinking about it, constructing logical and reasonable arguments, but now that he had to say it aloud, everything sounded absurd, even in his own mind. However, something in him knew that if he didn't say it now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "Last night I couldn't sleep," Richard began, looking her directly in the eyes with an honesty he rarely showed anyone. Isabella blinked in confusion, not understanding where this conversation was going, but too polite to interrupt him. He continued, choosing each word carefully, aware that he was about to cross a line he had never crossed with any employee before. "I kept thinking about what you told me, about your situation with your sister's wedding." Isabella visibly tensed, her fingers whitening as she gripped the coffee cup harder than necessary. She was probably mentally cursing herself for the moment she had let down her guard in front of him, preparing to hear unsolicited advice, or worse, condescending pity. But Richard wasn't going to give her any of those things. Instead, he took a deep breath and said something he hadn't even planned to say so directly. I understand what it's like to go to important events alone and pretend not to care. I've been doing it for years. The confession fell between them like a stone in still water, creating waves of surprise in Isabella's expression. She looked at him with new eyes, as if she were suddenly seeing a different person behind the expensive suit and the millionaire title. Richard took advantage of this moment of connection to continue, before he lost the courage he had gathered throughout that long, sleepless night. I thought a lot about what you said about needing a boyfriend for tomorrow, Richard continued, noticing how Isabella blushed intensely upon hearing her own words repeated in his voice. The shame was evident in every line of her face. But Richard didn't stop. He needed to finish this before his rational brain convinced him it was madness. And I realized something. You don't need to beg strangers, nor feel bad for asking for help. Isabella opened her mouth to protest, probably to say that she had never specifically asked for his help, that the phone conversation had been private, and he shouldn't have listened. But Richard raised a hand gently, asking her to let him finish, to listen to the end before judging what he was about to propose. She closed her mouth and nodded almost imperceptibly, her entire body tense, as if preparing for a blow. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, adopting a posture as approachable and non-threatening as possible. His next words came out more easily than he expected, as if they had been waiting to be said for hours. If you still need someone to go with you to the wedding, if you still need that boyfriend for a day, he paused, aware that the next words would change something between them irreversibly. I can be that person. The silence that followed was so absolute that Richard could hear the kitchen clock ticking, marking the seconds, each tick-tock echoing like a hammer striking metal. Isabella remained completely motionless, her expression frozen in a mixture of shock and utter confusion, as if Richard's words had been spoken in a foreign language that her brain refused to translate. The coffee cup trembled in her hands, and Richard feared for a moment that she would drop it, but she set it down on the table with mechanical movements, without taking her eyes off him. Her mouth opened and closed several times without making a sound, like a fish out of water gasping for air. Richard waited patiently, giving her time to process what she had just heard, aware that his proposal must sound completely absurd and unexpected. Finally, Isabella found her voice, though it came out choked and full of disbelief. You, what? She whispered, as if not trusting her own ears, as if needing confirmation that she had heard correctly. Richard repeated his offer, this time with more firmness, more conviction, making it clear that it was not a cruel joke, nor a misunderstanding. I can go with you to your sister's wedding. I can pretend to be your boyfriend for a day, just one day, nothing more. Isabella shook her head slowly, her expression changing from shock to suspicion, her years of experience teaching her that when something sounded too good to be true, it usually was. I don't understand, Isabella said in a trembling voice, taking a step back as if creating physical distance could help her think more clearly. Why would you do that? It doesn't make sense, Mr. Sterling. You don't really know me. I'm just your employee. The words came out fast, defensive, building walls where Richard was trying to build bridges. He understood her reaction. He understood the distrust, because he himself would have reacted the same way 24 hours ago. But something had changed in him during that sleepless night, something he couldn't explain logically, but felt with crystal clarity. He stood up from the chair, keeping his hands visible, making no sudden movements that might scare her further. You're right, we don't really know each other, but I know you've worked here for 3 years with dedication and honesty. I know you send money to your family every 2 weeks, and I know you're in a difficult situation that no one should face alone. Isabella looked at him with moist eyes, torn between hope and fear, between accepting help and keeping her pride intact. Richard continued, his voice taking on a softer, more vulnerable tone. I don't expect anything in return, Isabella. It's not a business deal, nor a transaction. It's simply a favor from one lonely person to another. The last sentence exposed him completely, revealing his own vulnerability in a way he had never done with anyone. Isabella gasped, tears silently running down her cheeks as she processed the sincerity in his words. And in that moment, in that kitchen lit by the dawn sun, something fundamental shifted between the lonely millionaire and his desperate employee. I don't know what to say, Isabella finally murmured, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. You don't have to say anything right now. Think about it. If you decide you want my help, I'll be available. If you prefer to find another solution, I'll understand perfectly. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his soul through his eyes. Why would you do this for me? Richard took a deep breath, preparing for an honesty he hadn't shown anyone in decades. Because last night, Listening to your story, I realized something. I've spent 45 years building a life that looks perfect from the outside, but is completely empty inside. You showed me what it's like to have people who truly care about you, even if it's in a complicated way." He paused, struggling with words he had never before said aloud. "And maybe, just for one day, I can be part of something real, something that matters." Isabella covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing softly, as she understood that this offer didn't come from superiority or pity, but from a loneliness that mirrored her own. "If I accept," she finally said, "it would really only be for one day. Afterwards, we would go back to normal. We would go back to exactly what it was before, if that's what you want." Isabella closed her eyes, taking several deep breaths before opening them and looking at him directly. "Okay," she whispered, "I accept your help." And with those simple words, both knew that nothing would be the same after that day. In the days following the conversation in the kitchen, the atmosphere in the house subtly changed. Isabella and Richard met more frequently than usual, planning details for the wedding, coordinating stories, trying to turn a necessary lie into something credible. Isabella had called her sister Sophia the night before to confirm she was coming with a companion. The joy in Sophia's voice had broken Isabella's heart, while also reassuring her. Her family could finally see her happy and well accompanied. "We need a consistent story," Richard said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while Isabella prepared dinner. It was strange how these planning moments had created an intimacy that had never existed between them. "How did we meet?" Isabella asked, chopping onions, grateful for an excuse for her watery eyes. Richard thought for a moment. "Let's say we met when I needed to hire specialized workers for a project, and you recommended good people from your hometown. We started talking, became friends, and gradually, it turned into something more. It was simple, credible, based on partial truths. And how long have we been dating? 6 months seems like a good amount of time. Not too recent to seem suspicious, not too old for them to expect a bigger commitment." Over the next 2 days, they practiced small role plays, how to greet each other, how he should treat her, what kind of affection would be appropriate for a couple of 6 months. Isabella felt strange rehearsing intimacy with the man she had worked for 3 years. But Richard was respectful, always asking if she was comfortable, always maintaining the boundaries she set. "My family will ask a lot of questions," Isabella warned. "They're curious, especially my Aunt Carol. She'll want to know everything about you. Let her ask. I'll be myself, just adapting a few things. I'm an entrepreneur. I have a small construction company. I live in a nice apartment in New York. Nothing too extravagant." Isabella smiled for the first time since this whole madness began. "You're good at this, Richard," he gently corrected. "If we're going to pretend to date, you need to call me by my name. And please, stop calling me Mr. Sterling, at least while this lasts." The name sounded strange on Isabella's lips. "Richard," she repeated to get used to it. "It's different." On the morning of the wedding, Richard dressed in a dark suit, but not overly formal. He had carefully chosen an outfit that looked good, but not ostentatiously expensive. He wanted to make a good impression without intimidating anyone. Isabella had bought a simple navy blue dress with her own money, despite Richard's offers to cover the cost of her attire. It was beautiful, elegant, suitable for the occasion, without being flashy. When they met in the penthouse foyer, both looked at each other as if it were the first time they truly saw each other. Isabella was beautiful, her hair loose and framing her face, a natural beauty Richard had never truly noticed. And he looked different, without the invisible armor of authority he always wore. "Ready?" Richard asked, offering his arm. "As ready as I can be to pretend I'm dating you," Isabella replied with a nervous little smile. The drive to rural Georgia would take about 4 hours. Richard drove his more discreet pickup truck, not the luxury sedan he usually used, following Isabella's directions along roads that gradually changed from the perfect asphalt of the city to dusty country lanes. Isabella hadn't stopped fidgeting with her hands throughout the journey. They had rehearsed, they had planned everything. But now that the moment was approaching, she felt nauseous with nerves. "What if they realize we're lying?" she asked for the 10th time. "They won't," Richard said with more confidence than he felt. "We're two intelligent adults, pretending something thousands of couples do naturally every day. We can manage for a few hours. My mother has a special radar for lies. Then we won't lie. We'll just play an alternate version of the truth." Despite her nervousness, Isabella laughed. "Mr. Sterling has an interesting way of looking at things." As they approached Isabella's hometown, she pointed out familiar landmarks: the school where she studied, the park where she played as a child, the house where she lived before coming to New York. Richard observed everything with genuine interest. It was a world completely different from his New York of skyscrapers and endless traffic. Here there was green space, a pace of life that seemed almost alien to him. "It's beautiful here," he commented sincerely. "It's simple," Isabella said, "very different from your life. Simple isn't a flaw. Sometimes I think we complicate things too much." When they finally arrived at Isabella's family home, a humble but well-maintained house with a flower-filled front garden, Richard felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the nervousness of business deals or important meetings. It was something more primitive, the fear of not being accepted, of disappointing people who mattered to someone who was starting to matter to him. "They'll love you," Isabella said softly, as if she had read his thoughts. "You're a good man, Richard. It shows." And for the first time in many years, Richard desperately wanted that to be true. The house exploded with activity as Isabella and Richard stepped out of the truck. Aunts, cousins, neighbors, all dressed in their best clothes for the big day. The scent of southern comfort food permeated the air: biscuits and gravy, peach cobbler, sweet potato pie. Isabella was immediately engulfed in hugs, kisses, and exclamations of joy. Richard remained a little apart, observing, smiling politely, as he waited for his turn to be introduced. The first to approach was a frail woman, with gray hair, but eyes sparkling with emotion. No introduction was needed. It was clearly Isabella's mother. "Mom," Isabella said with a choked voice, "this is..." The woman studied Richard from head to toe for a moment that seemed eternal. Then, instead of shaking his outstretched hand, she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered in his ear. "Thank you for taking care of my girl." Richard didn't know what to say. The sincerity in the woman's voice disarmed him completely. When she pulled away, there were tears in her eyes, but also a radiant smile. Come in. Sophia is finishing getting ready. Isabella, your sister will be so happy to see you, and even happier to meet this handsome young man." Isabella's father appeared next. A man with calloused hands and an honest face, clearly uncomfortable with so many people and so much commotion. He greeted Richard with a firm handshake and a respectful nod. "Welcome to the family," he simply said, and Richard felt the weight of those words. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of introductions. Aunt Carol, exactly as Isabella had described, asked 50 questions in 5 minutes. The cousins wanted to know about New York. The neighbors commented on how much happier Isabella seemed. Richard answered everything with patience and genuine friendliness. It was surprising how easy it was to like these people. There was a warmth, an immediate acceptance that he had never experienced. When Sophia finally appeared, radiant in her simple but beautiful wedding dress, Richard understood why Isabella had sacrificed so much for this family. The love was palpable, real, transformative. "Isabella," Sophia cried, running to hug her sister. "I can't believe you came, and you brought a boyfriend." She turned to Richard with a smile that lit up the entire room. "So, you're the man who won our Isabella's heart." "Actually," Richard said, surprising himself with the sincerity, "I think I'm the one who was won over." Isabella looked at him in surprise, but there was something warm in her gaze, something that made Richard's heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with acting. The ceremony was held in the local church, small but full of flowers and love. Richard sat beside Isabella in the front row, watching as Sophia walked down the aisle towards the groom, a simple but clearly smitten young man. During the ceremony, Isabella cried, not tears of sadness, but of pure joy, seeing her younger sister fulfilling her dream of marrying for love. Richard offered her his handkerchief without thinking, a gesture so natural that he didn't even realize he was no longer acting. "Thank you," Isabella whispered. "You're welcome," he replied. And for a moment, their eyes met with an intensity that was anything but fake. The reception was held in the backyard of the house, decorated with colorful banners and simple lights. There was a small stage where a local band played country music, getting everyone to dance. Richard, who normally didn't dance at elegant parties, found himself being pulled onto the makeshift dance floor by Isabella. It was strange how well their bodies moved together, as if they had danced 1,000 times before. "You dance well," Isabella commented, smiling. "You sound surprised. Millionaire executives don't usually know how to line dance. Maybe you don't know the right executives," Richard quipped, making her laugh. It was during that dance that Richard truly looked at Isabella. He really saw her, not the efficient employee, not the desperate woman asking for help, but the complete person she was. He saw how she cared for everyone around her, adjusted Sophia's veil, comforted her mother when emotion overwhelmed her, played with her nieces and nephews, greeted every neighbor as if they were family. Isabella radiated light, there was no other word. Every gesture demonstrated genuine love. Every word came out charged with true affection. And Richard wondered how he had spent 3 years without seeing this. It was when the band announced a couples game that things got complicated. All couples had to kiss when the music stopped. Isabella looked at Richard with evident panic. They hadn't rehearsed this. Just a quick peck, he whispered as the music played. To convince everyone, Isabella nodded, her cheeks coloring in a way Richard found unexpectedly charming. The music stopped. The kiss should have been technical, quick, just to maintain the charade. But when Richard's lips touched Isabella's, something happened. The world stopped. The noise of the party disappeared. The people around them blurred. For an eternal instant, there were only the two of them, connected at that soft point of contact. When they separated, Isabella's eyes were wide open, looking at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Surprise, confusion, and something deeper that made his heart beat erratically. The crowd applauded and whistled, happy to see Isabella finally with someone. But Richard barely heard the shouts of approval. He was completely focused on Isabella's golden brown eyes, trying to understand what had just happened. Because one thing was certain, that had not just been acting. The rest of the party passed in a blur for Richard. He operated on autopilot, smiled when appropriate, answered questions, danced when asked, but his mind was completely... Isabella seemed equally affected. She avoided looking directly at him, but stayed close, as expected of a real girlfriend. When they had to interact, there was an electric tension between them that definitely hadn't been there that morning. Later that night, as the party began to quiet down and some guests left, Isabella's mother approached Richard. "May I speak with you for a minute?" she asked softly. They walked to the back garden, away from the noise. The woman turned to him, her eyes still moist with emotion. "I was very worried about Isabella," she began. "She has always been so dedicated to the family, always sacrificing for others. She never thought of herself, of her own future." Richard listened in silence, feeling the weight of the responsibility of maintaining that lie. "But today," she continued, "today I saw my girl truly smile. I saw her relax, be happy, and I saw how you look at her." "How do I look at her?" "Like a man who found his treasure," the woman said with a wise smile. "Isabella deserves this. She deserves to be loved the way you love her." The words hit Richard like a lightning bolt. He opened his mouth to protest, to say it wasn't quite like that, but realized that maybe it was exactly like that. "Take good care of her," Isabella's mother said, touching his arm gently. "She has suffered enough." When they returned to the party, Richard sought Isabella with his eyes. He found her helping to clear dishes, always caring for others. But when she looked at him and smiled a natural smile, without pretense, he knew her mother was right. He was falling in love with Isabella. The question was, what to do with that feeling? Later that night, when most of the guests had left, and Sophia and her husband departed for their honeymoon at a quaint inn nearby, Isabella and Richard found themselves alone in the garden. The party lights were still on, but the music had stopped. There was something magical about the quiet of the country night, with thousands of stars visible in a way they never were in New York. Isabella hugged herself, looking up as if searching for answers in those distant lights. Richard stood beside her in silence, giving her the space she needed to process the day. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the distant chirping of crickets. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. What you did today, pretending to be my boyfriend, meeting my family, enduring all the questions." Her voice faltered slightly. "You gave my mother a day of peace. I saw her smile in a way I haven't seen in months." Richard turned to look at her. "Your mother is an incredible woman. I see where you get your strength." "My strength, Isabella? You sent money to your family for years. You sacrificed your own life for the well-being of others. You worked long hours to pay for medical treatments, and even when desperate, you maintained your dignity." He paused, struggling with words he had never said aloud. "You are the strongest person I know." Isabella turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I don't feel strong. Today I felt like a liar." "Why?" "Because at times I didn't feel like I was pretending." The confession hung between them in the night air, laden with terrifying and exciting possibilities. Richard took a step closer. "I know what you mean. You know, that kiss was just to convince everyone," Isabella hastened to say, but her voice didn't sound convincing, even to herself. "Was it?" Isabella stared at him for a long moment. "I don't know, and that scares me." Richard reached out, gently touching her face. "It scares me too, but maybe not everything has to be pretended." For a moment, it seemed she would lean towards him, but then she took a step back, returning to reality. "Richard, you're my boss. I work in your house. This complicates everything. Only if we let it complicate things. It's easy to say, but tomorrow we go back to New York, to real life. And I go back to being the housekeeper, and you go back to being the millionaire. What if I don't want it to be like that? Then, I don't know what to say. They remained standing there, 2 feet apart, but an eternity of social differences between them, until Isabella's mother appeared at the back door. "Kids, it's late." "Isabella, I've prepared the front room for you both." Isabella blushed. "Mom, we don't. No need to be ashamed, daughter. You're adults." And before either could protest, she disappeared back inside the house. Isabella covered her face with her hands. "She thinks we're sleeping together." "I can sleep on the sofa," Richard offered quickly. "It won't look strange. Come on, we'll figure it out." But both knew that night would be anything but simple. The room was small and cozy, with a double bed that dominated the space. Isabella looked at it as if it were a trap. "I can sleep on the floor," Richard offered. "Don't be ridiculous. We're adults. We can share a bed without anything happening." But her voice trembled slightly as she said it. They took turns in the bathroom to change. Richard returned wearing a t-shirt and shorts. Isabella appeared in simple, modest pajamas. Still, he found it hard not to look. They lay on the bed, maintaining a respectful distance, both rigid as planks. The silence was deafening. "Richard, yes. What did your mother say about you falling in love? She was wrong, right? It was just part of the act." Richard was silent for a long time. So long that Isabella thought he had fallen asleep. "I don't know," he finally said. "Today was the most real day I've had in years, and it wasn't because of the act. Because of what then? Because of you. Because of seeing you with your family. Seeing how you love, how you care for everyone. Because I realized I spent 3 years seeing only a housekeeper when I should have seen an incredible person." Isabella turned to look at him in the darkness. "Richard, I know this complicates everything. I know our situation is impossible, but I can't pretend I don't feel anything. What do you feel?" He turned to her too, their faces just inches apart on the pillow. "I feel that for the first time in my life, I'm truly in love. Not with the idea of someone, not out of convenience, but with who you really are." Tears ran silently down Isabella's cheeks. "This can't work. We're from very different worlds. What if we weren't? What if we were just 2 people who found each other? But we're not just 2 people. I depend on my job. You're my boss. Then change that. How? I don't know yet. But if you feel something too, we can find out together." Isabella closed her eyes. "I'm scared." "Me too." They remained like that, looking at each other in the darkness. 2 lonely people who had found something unexpected amidst a necessary lie. Finally, Richard whispered, "We can go back to New York and pretend none of this happened if that's what you want. Or we can see where this takes us. What if it goes wrong? What if it goes right?" Isabella didn't answer, but she also didn't pull away when Richard reached out and gently touched her face, wiping away her tears. They fell asleep like that, closer than they had been all day of pretense, finally being honest with each other in the darkness of that small room. Tomorrow came too soon. Isabella woke up nestled against Richard's chest, her head resting on his shoulder, as if it were the most natural place in the world. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot all the complications. There was only his warmth, the sound of his breathing, the feeling of security she had never experienced. Then reality returned like a bucket of cold water. She carefully pulled away, trying not to wake him, but Richard opened his eyes as soon as she moved. "Good morning," he said in a sleep-roughened voice. "Good morning. We should get ready. We promised to get back to New York early." The atmosphere between them was strange, no longer the artificial tension of the day before, but something deeper and more frightening. The natural intimacy of the night had revealed something neither of them knew how to handle. Breakfast with the family was painfully normal. Isabella's mother prepared a feast. Biscuits and gravy, country cheese, peach cobbler. Everyone wanted to know when Richard would return, when the next family gathering would be. "Soon," he replied vaguely, avoiding Isabella's gaze. The goodbyes were emotional. Isabella's mother hugged Richard, as if he were truly part of the family. "Thank you for taking care of my girl," she repeated. "Thank you for welcoming me as a son," he replied, surprising himself with the sincerity. The return journey was completely different from the outbound one. The silence was no longer nervous, but heavy with unspoken things. Isabella looked out the window at the passing landscape, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked after 2 hours of almost total silence. "About how everything changed in 2 days." "Changed? Don't you feel it? Yesterday morning, we were boss and housekeeper, pretending to be dating. Today, I don't know what we are." Richard slowed down and pulled into a roadside rest area. He turned off the engine and faced her. "Isabella, I need to tell you something." She looked at him with apprehension. "I don't want you to work for me anymore." Isabella's face went pale. "Are you firing me?" "No, it's not that. It's just that I can't pretend you're just my housekeeper after what happened. I can't see you every day preparing my coffee, cleaning my house, being invisible again. So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying, I want to get to know you for real. I want to go out with you, talk to you, discover who Isabella is when she's not working. Richard, I need that job. I need to send money to my family, and you'll continue sending it. I'm not leaving you without support. I'm offering you a chance to be more than my employee." "How?" "I don't know exactly. I just know I want to try something real with you. I know yesterday was the happiest day I've had in years, and it wasn't because of the acting." Isabella took a deep breath. "What if it doesn't work out? What if we discover it was just a moment? Then at least we'll know we tried." They sat in that gas station on the side of the road, two worlds about to collide or unite. "I need to think," Isabella finally said. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know. This is all very confusing, very fast." Richard nodded. "Okay, but Isabella, don't pretend yesterday didn't happen. Don't treat me like a distant boss again. Be honest with me, even if it's to say no." For the rest of the journey, they talked about small things: the party, Isabella's family, the differences between city and country life. It was a real conversation between two people getting to know each other, not between employee and boss. When they arrived at Richard's penthouse, reality hit them completely. The doorman greeted Richard formally and nodded politely to Isabella. The gilded elevator took them to a world of luxury that seemed alien after the simplicity of Isabella's family home. "Well," Isabella said when they reached the foyer, "thank you for everything. It was special, Isabella?" "Yes. Don't thank me as if it were a favor. It was real for me." She looked at him with bright eyes. "For me too." And then, before either could overthink it, she leaned in and kissed him, a soft but intense kiss, laden with all the confusion and emotion of the past 2 days. When they separated, both were breathless. "I need to think," she repeated. "I know." Isabella picked up her bag and headed for the staff quarters, where she always slept when she worked late, but at the door she stopped and turned. "Richard." "Yes? Thank you for helping me see that I deserve more." And with that, she disappeared, leaving Richard alone in the foyer of his empty penthouse, knowing that his life had changed forever. The next few days were strange for both of them. Isabella continued working, but there was a constant tension in the air. They treated each other politely, but avoided being alone in the same room for too long. Richard tried to focus on work, but found himself thinking about Isabella constantly. Every time he heard her footsteps in the house, he wanted to seek her out, talk, and understand what she was thinking. Isabella, for her part, was at war with herself. Part of her wanted to dive into that possibility, to explore what could exist between them. But the practical part, the one that had survived 3 years sending money to her family, warned her about the risks. What if it didn't work out? What if it was just a momentary infatuation between two lonely people? What if she lost not only her job, but also the financial stability her family depended on? It was on Thursday night that Isabella made her decision. She found Richard in his office, reviewing documents, as he always did when he wanted to avoid thinking about other things. "Can I talk to you?" He looked up immediately, as if he had been waiting for this moment for days. "Of course." Isabella sat in the chair opposite his desk, but couldn't look him directly in the eye. "I've thought a lot about what we talked about, and I think you're right. I can't keep working here after what happened." Richard's heart sank. "Isabella, no, let me finish. I can't continue because I wouldn't be able to pretend we're just boss and housekeeper. Because every time I look at you, I remember how you cared for my family, how you made me feel special." She finally found the courage to look at him. "But I'm also scared." "Of what?" "That this is just gratitude on my part. That you're confusing loneliness with love. That we're from such different worlds that it could never work." Richard got up and walked around the desk, kneeling beside her chair. "Isabella, I understand your fears, but what if we're missing something special because of fear? What if we're deluding ourselves? Then we'll find out together. But you can't make this decision alone, based only on fear." Isabella touched his face gently. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we try, that you go out with me, talk to me, give me a chance to get to know you outside of this context, that we see if what we feel is real, and my job, my stability. You'll find another job if you want to work, or you can study, do something you've always wanted. Financially, you'll be secure while we figure this out." That sounds very risky. Love always is risky, but the alternative is to live always wondering, what if? Isabella closed her eyes. wrestling with the hardest decision of her life. "Okay," she finally said. "Let's try." Richard smiled for the first time in days. "Seriously?" "Seriously, but with conditions." "What conditions?" "Slowly. Nothing rushed. I want to be sure this is real before." "Before?" Isabella blushed. "Before anything more serious." "Agreed. Slowly. And if it doesn't work out, do you promise me it won't be awkward, that we can move on with our lives without drama?" "I promise." Isabella took a deep breath. "So, do you want to have dinner with me tomorrow, like two normal people, at a normal restaurant?" "I'd love to." And for the first time since they returned from the country, both genuinely smiled. Richard was more nervous for that dinner than for any business meeting he had ever had. He chose a small, cozy Italian restaurant. Nothing too fancy that might intimidate Isabella, but also nothing too casual that would seem sloppy. He arrived 15 minutes early and waited at a corner table, mentally reviewing everything he wanted to say, everything he wanted to ask. When Isabella arrived, he almost didn't recognize her. She wore a simple green dress that accentuated her eyes, her hair loose and framing her face. She was beautiful in a natural, unadorned way, in a way that made Richard's stomach flutter. "Hi," she said, clearly as nervous as he was. "Hi, you look beautiful." Isabella blushed. "Thanks, you look good too." They sat down, and for a few minutes there was only silence as they pretended to study the menu. Finally, Richard laughed. "This is ridiculous." "What? We've known each other for 3 years, and we're acting like two teenagers on a first date." Isabella laughed too, and the tension began to ease. "It's just strange. Different. Good different or bad different? I don't know yet." During dinner, they talked about things they had never discussed. Richard told her about his childhood, how he started in business, about his abandoned dreams of traveling the world. Isabella spoke about her life in the country, about the decision to come to New York, about her secret desire to study nursing. "Why nursing?" Richard asked. "I've always liked taking care of people, and after seeing my mother sick, I think I want to help other families going through the same thing." "Why didn't you ever study?" "Money, time, responsibilities. And now, if you had the opportunity..." Isabella looked at him carefully. "Are you offering?" "I'm asking what you want." I've always wanted to, but it seems like too big a dream. The best dreams always do." After dinner, they walked down the street quietly. It was a warm New York night, with the city lights creating an almost romantic atmosphere. "Isabella," Richard said, stopping. "Yes? I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay, are you here because you feel something for me, or because you're grateful for what I did?" Isabella thought for a long moment before answering. "At Sophia's wedding, when you danced with me, when you kissed me, for a moment I forgot it was pretend. I forgot you were my boss, that I was your housekeeper. For a moment it was just us. And now I'm terrified because I don't know if I can distinguish between gratitude and feeling, but I know I want to find out." "Then let's find out together." Richard extended his hand. Isabella looked at it for a moment, then took it. It was that simple. Two adults choosing to try. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster for both. Isabella had officially stopped working for Richard, but still lived in the penthouse while looking for her own apartment. They established a strange but sweet routine. Richard left for work in the morning. Isabella stayed home studying for her nursing school entrance exam. He had insisted on paying for a preparatory course. In the afternoon, they met to talk, sometimes dining out, sometimes cooking together. It was in these small moments that Richard discovered who Isabella truly was. He saw how she concentrated when she studied, her tongue peeking out at the corner of her mouth, how she hummed while cooking, how her eyes lit up when she talked about her dream of helping others. Isabella, in turn, got to know a Richard she had never imagined. Outside the work environment, he was funny, attentive, surprisingly humble. He had interesting opinions on everything, but he listened more than he spoke. He was generous without being condescending. "You know what surprises me most about you?" Isabella said one night, as they washed dishes together after dinner. "What?" "How normal you are." Richard laughed. "Thanks, I guess." "No, seriously, I expected someone with your money to be arrogant, distant, but you're human, and is that good?" "It's great." It was that night they kissed again. Not a goodbye kiss or a thank you kiss, but a real kiss, laden with weeks of tension and mutual discovery. When they separated, both were breathless. "Isabella," Richard whispered. "I know," she replied. "I feel it too." But they weren't ready to take the next step yet. There were layers of insecurity, social differences, and mutual fears that needed to be worked through. The first real problem arose when Richard had to attend a business event, a charity gala, where all of New York's elite would be present. "Come with me," he asked. Isabella turned pale. "I can't go to something like that." "Why not?" "Because I don't belong in that world. Because all those people will know I am that I was what? Your housekeeper." The words hung between them like a physical barrier. "Isabella, does that matter to you?" "It shouldn't matter to you. It doesn't matter to me." "Richard, be realistic. You're going to introduce an ex-housekeeper as your girlfriend to your business partners." The question was fair, and it hurt Richard because it touched on insecurities he didn't want to admit. I would introduce you as Isabella, the woman I'm getting to know, the woman who means something to me. But when they ask how we met, when they want to know my background, my family." Richard had no immediate answer, and his silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Isabella said sadly. "It's not what you're thinking." "No? Then tell me, Richard, are you prepared to introduce me to your wealthy friends so they can see the millionaire businessman dating the former cleaner?" "Don't talk about yourself like that, because it's not the truth. It's not the complete truth. You are so much more than that. To you, maybe. To them, I'll always be the housekeeper who landed a boss." The argument ended with Isabella locking herself in her room and Richard going to the event alone. All night, he felt empty, feigning interest in conversations about business and charity, while thinking of Isabella alone at home. When he returned, he found her in the kitchen drinking tea. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "For what?" "For not having an answer, for hesitating." Isabella looked at him with tired eyes. "Richard, it's not about you hesitating. It's about reality. We're from different worlds. What if we change that?" "How?" "I don't know yet, but I don't want to give up on us because of other people." Isabella sighed. "I don't want to either, but we need to be realistic about the challenges. Then we face them together. Together." And even with all the difficulties, both knew they wanted to try. After that first real argument, something changed between them. Paradoxically, it brought them closer. They had faced a real difficulty and chosen to stay together. Isabella began to attend some smaller events with Richard, intimate dinners with a few friends, casual gatherings. Gradually, she relaxed, realizing that not everyone in Richard's social circle was presumptuous or judgmental. Richard, in turn, began to frequent Isabella's world. He met her friends from the preparatory course. He went to a few family barbecues. They visited her family in the country twice. "You know my mom is already planning our wedding, right?" Isabella said after one of those visits. "And does that bother you?" "A little." "And you? The idea of marriage or your mom's plans?" Isabella blushed. "The idea doesn't bother me. Actually, what? Actually, I've been thinking about it too." Isabella almost choked on her coffee. "Seriously?" "Seriously. Not for right now. Not as pressure, but as a future possibility. Richard, we haven't even slept together yet. And you're thinking about marriage?" "I'm thinking about the future, about building something real and lasting with you." Isabella was silent for a long moment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how scary and wonderful this is at the same time. Good scary or bad scary?" "I don't know yet," she admitted with a small smile. 3 months after Sophia's wedding, on a warm summer night, Isabella and Richard were on the penthouse balcony, looking at the lights of New York. They had eaten dinner at home, cooked together, talked about their day. "Richard," Isabella said suddenly. "Yes, I'm ready." "Ready for what?" She turned to look at him, her eyes serious but determined, to stop being afraid, to trust what we have. Richard felt his heart race. "Are you sure?" "I am. These months have shown me that this is real, that you are real, that what I feel is real." "Richard, no, let me speak. I've spent my whole life taking care of others, sacrificing my dreams, my happiness. For the first time, someone wants to take care of me. For the first time, I feel worthy of love." Richard approached her, gently touching her face. "You've always been worthy. You just hadn't found the right person to see it. And are you sure I'm the right person? The uneducated ex-housekeeper from the country?" "Stop," Richard interrupted. "You are the woman who sacrificed her life for her family, who works hard for everything she has, who lights up any room she enters, who made me remember what it means to be alive." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You are the realest person I know, and yes, I am sure you are the right person." The kiss that followed was different from all the others. It was a kiss of surrender, of promise, of the future. When they finally separated, Richard whispered, "I love you, Isabella." "I love you too," she replied without hesitation. And that night, for the first time, they truly slept together. Not as boss and employee sharing a bed out of necessity, but as two people who had chosen to build something together. We've reached the end of this beautiful story of Richard and Isabella. It teaches us that true love can be born from the simplest and most unexpected gestures. Sometimes, a single act of kindness can transform two lives forever and show that social differences are not an obstacle when there is genuine love and a willingness to fight together. If this story touched your heart as much as it touched ours, don't forget to leave your like and share it with friends and family who also believe in the transformative power of love. Your support helps us immensely to continue creating stories that inspire and move. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to not miss any new stories of love, overcoming, and hope. And tell us in the comments your name and what city you're watching us from. We love knowing we have friends scattered all over the USA who enjoy our stories. A warm hug, and until the next story,